So welcome everyone to Howling Coyote. And I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Penobscot Nation. And I want to acknowledge their elders past, present, and future. And of course, this is beaming to you from Bangor, Maine. And I'm happy to have on the program again Margaret Mette, who's a professor of nursing at the University of Alaska in Kodiak, Alaska, which is affiliated with Anchorage, University of Alaska at Anchorage. And she's very involved with the revitalization efforts of the Indigenous people in Kodiak and with bringing more Indigenous people into nursing and healthcare in general, and improving the health of Indigenous people. So, and she's just finished a PhD that relates to all these topics. So it'll be exciting to catch up because it's been over a year since she spoke with me, and we'll hear all kinds of new things and exciting things. So take it away, Margie.
Thanks, Louis. So I'll just do a little land acknowledgement for here in Kodiak. I live in the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Alutiiq people. And the name Kodiak is actually based on the Alutiiq word kiktak, meaning island. And so they have a very complex history and a rich culture. And I'm asking you all to join me in honoring the families and tribal members that are still connected to this land. So last time we spoke, I actually was not finished with the research project or the dissertation, and the title of it was Exploring Indigenous Holistic Healing Practices, Identifying Connections with Nature and Spirit to Enable Providers to Meet the Healthcare Needs of Indigenous People. And being brought up in a Western educational background, I was looking for the missing piece, the little minute piece that could help us provide more holistic healthcare services to the people on the island. I knew that we weren't doing a really good job of it. And what I sensed was that we were missing the spiritual aspect, because I know I used to work at the Kodiak Area Native Association, and I knew that cultural revitalization efforts back in the 90s is when I worked at CANA, Kodiak Area Native Association. And I knew that the cultural revitalization efforts was a very big healing mechanism in and of itself. And it seemed to me that all of the collection of the culture and reestablishing of the traditions, the dance, the language, and all of the practices, because they were so healing, they all seemed to be based in spirituality. And it seemed like that was what was missing and what we provided but what I found out through all of this is that, a Western perspective, you're looking for that missing piece, and you feel like if you plug the hole in, then you have holistic care. And that wasn't what it really was all about. That, may be comprehensive, where yes, I've addressed the physical needs. Yes, I've addressed the emotional needs. Yes, I've addressed the social needs. You can't just add, I've addressed or asked about their spiritual needs and feel like you're done. Because in the Indigenous world, from what I learned from the participants, is that spirituality is part of it all. It's ingrained in everything. And it's the big picture. Just as Western medicine looks at the minute, small pieces and objective data, Indigenous approach to health and healing and living is holistic and broad, subjective and interconnected and, relationship oriented. And so it had anything that was involved with health or healing had a spiritual component. And Louis, I tell you this all the time, but one of my favorite quotes of yours is, in the Indigenous world, healing is always spiritual, regardless of what other modalities are used. And so that was a big focus for me. I learned more. You get to understand it better when you have mentors that were the participants in the research study. So that, as I said, that was the name of the research project then. And I've lived here for a long time, and I did feel a connection here. And just to quote Duran, when we come upon a place with the right attitude, we can learn the meaning of sacredness. So I'm grateful that I realized throughout this process that spirituality and sacredness are part of this land and connected to these people that are the governors of this land, the people that continue to safeguard this land and welcome everybody to it. And in the course of the process, I found out that all of these cultural revitalization efforts were bringing people back to health and healing in and of themselves. And when I dug into it, anything that they did was connected back to one of their core values. And so I ended up having to even change the name of the research project, and it ended up being called Celebrating Alutiiq Cultural Revitalization, Pathways to Holistic Individual Health and Community Wellness. Because what they told me was there wasn't one spiritual practice or one mechanism. Everything was very individualized, but anything could connect people back to their spiritual energy and restore their spiritual energy. And so if you looked back at their values, they emphasized interconnection and a holistic perspective. They emphasized balance in all of the spheres of body, mind, and spirit. And their core values provide lessons for well-being. Even their concept of worldview or values to them means humanity or integrity as a human being. And so again, I looked back at their core values, and that was what helped me be able to take all of the comments and input that they said and come up with some themes. But just to give you some overview of what their Alutiiq core values are. And again, these are their pathways to holistic health. And like respect for self, others, and our environment is inherent in all of these values. Their elders, our elders, that's one of their values. Family and the kinship of our ancestors and living relatives. Sharing, we welcome everyone. I can attest to that. They've been very welcoming to everybody that comes to this island. Trust, our people, we are responsible for each other and ourselves. Learning by doing, observing, and listening. Being a professor of nursing, that's kind of frustrating to teach from a textbook and expect people to memorize all of these things from a textbook when they really learn much better by being immersed in providing care. And so that made a lot of sense to me too. Sense of humor. They are a very any gathering has lots of laughs and sharing of stories and kidding and joking, and you know that you're part of it when they tease you. So it's sense of humor was one of their values. Our heritage language, ties to our homeland, a subsistence lifestyle, respect of and sustained by the natural world, traditional arts, skills, and ingenuity, stewardship of the animals, land, sky, and waters, faith and a spiritual life from ancestral beliefs to the diverse faiths of today. So those were the core values. And I'm going to share my screen here because what I want to show you is, again, taking it from a Western perspective, I ended up, can you see this?
Yes.
So I ended up coming up with the themes based on, a logical, analytical, table-oriented method. The themes that came up was that balance was really important. You can't be holistically healthy if your life isn't balanced. And so this was the definition of what I meant by that. They talked about spiritual distress can be manifested in some type of an imbalance, either a physical symptom, an emotional or mental health symptom, or from the soul wound from historical trauma. And then they talked about the importance of relationships, how relationships can help you restore balance or can be the mechanism for a problem with spiritual well-being. And so then there was the human realm, the spiritual realm, and the natural realm. And again, this was me coming at it from the way I grew up and learned in Western ideology. But my chair and the Alutiiq members of my committee said, no, we need to see this in some sort of a diagram, something that's more vibrant and expresses it in a more fluid way, something that shows that it's not just laying it out into that structured format. So this is what I ended up coming up with, that when somebody, a being in the world, a human in the world, is always looking to be balanced, and we're energy, and we are always interconnected with each other, the land, the spiritual realm. So we're kind of like whirlwinds or whirlpools. We're just always moving and cycling, but we are, because we're moving and balancing all of these energies, we are on a kind of a point, and it can be tipped over one way or the other. So holistic health can be influenced by a physical ailment or an emotional distress. And so again, the four or the three aspects of being holistically healthy: body, mind, and spirit. Spirit is everything. It's the whole energy system. And the body and the mind, again, can be, they're balancing. The health of the body and the mind is balancing on this point. And then our relationships are also part of those energies that are fluid. So again, spirit, the cohesive energy force of our being, infused in all components as the communication network that promotes integration. And spirit communicates both internally with ourselves, but also with our fellow human beings, with the land, with the animals, with nature. Our body, again, the physical component of our human form. Our mind, our thoughts and emotions, and they trigger emotional or behavioral responses. And then relationships are connections with either ourself, our family, our community, the natural realm, which are, as I mentioned, the animals, land, and sky and waters, and then the spiritual realm, the creator, ancestors. And so anything can help you restore balance that addresses any of these components, but it can also be the mechanism for tipping people over. So if I have a fight with my sister, that can tip my balance over, but we make up, and then my balance can, kind of right itself. That energy force, the spiritual energy force of the being, can be righted again. So all of the core values, again, they always emphasized that it was very individual. It didn't mean what worked for me didn't necessarily work for someone else. They always hesitated to say what they thought could be implemented to restore balance for any other person. They always said that somebody needs to decide for themselves what's going to help them restore their balance if they're feeling unwell in any of these realms. They would share what worked for them, but they always said that whatever another person needed could be completely different from what worked for them. Some people talked about being involved in the dance group and how that was restorative to their balance. The art, restoring their Indigenous art forms, their language. But if you look at the core values, just remembering those was helpful. And then, in the course of studying for this degree, we learned about Oscar Coagley, who was up in the mainland of Alaska, who's not with us anymore in this worldly realm, but he came up with this tetrahedral model that talks about Indigenous relationships with the human realm. This was the worldview from his perspective, from an Indigenous perspective, and he wrote about this extensively. And so he showed how the natural, spiritual, and human realm were all interconnected. And so my thought about this was that each of us in the human realm are these little individual cyclones or whirlwinds, and we're all balanced on this human realm next to each other. And if one of us tips over, we impact somebody else, and if we help right somebody else, we help restore that balance. So we're all integrated into this system, and what affects us affects everybody. And it just is very telling how you can look at that Indigenous worldview and understand how relationships and interconnection mean so much. So again, finding out what helps one person can help many others in the community. And it's not just saying, okay, well, I asked them about their spiritual health, so I've ticked that box off and now I can move on to something else. You have to realize that in it has a bigger impact than just that one person and just that one interaction. And so, that was basically how it had to be changed. The participants confirmed that the mind-body-spirit connection was integral to establishing, maintaining, or restoring holistic health. And any recognition or integration of a spiritual practice that could contribute to the holistic health of an individual person would contribute to their health, their family's health, and the community's health, and that ultimately they could find some guidance by looking at those established Alutiiq core values and participating in whatever the cultural revitalization efforts were happening at the time, whatever worked for them. And they were a framework to help people find the personal solutions to maintain or restore their balance. And it helped them facilitate controlling their own outcomes. That was a key conclusion. And then, as I said a couple of times, the health of an individual contributes to the overall health of the community. That kind of connects to what Lewis works with all the time, the looking both ways with two-eyed seeing. There is a book that I looked at called Looking Both Ways. A lot of times it's a book that was about the Alutiiq cultural revitalization efforts. And there was a elder in Old Harbor, Sven Hawkinson, who made a comment once: you've got to look back and find out the past, and then you look forward. And so that's what they are doing here. They're recognizing that there has been historical trauma, and they are looking at ways to recognize it, but move forward from it, celebrating their resilience, and that they're a vibrant living culture, and making their language be current and vibrant. And so that pairs with the two-eyed seeing that Lewis talks about with Elder Albert Marshall, because that means that, two-eyed seeing, learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledge and ways of knowing, to use both of those eyes together for the benefit of all. And so I think that that's what's going on here in this community. They're recognizing it's not that they're discarding or abandoning Western approaches to health or healing, but they're using their Indigenous knowledge to integrate their health, keep themselves healthy in their own way. And I think that I saw it happening beginning in the 90s. When I got here in the 90s, I worked a lot with people that were struggling, and the revitalization effort was just getting launched here. And I've seen a lot of progress in it, going from a damaged centered perspective to a celebration of what has been, maintained in the resilience, rather than looking at the problems, looking at how people have been able to survive and continue to survive and thrive. And it's a vibrant culture versus, the damage that occurred in the past from historical trauma. Don't focus on that. Focus on celebrating the revitalization and vibrant living culture that it still is.
Yeah, it occurred to me that some people will be new to hearing you, and I thought it would be useful if you could just spend a couple minutes and talk about your methodology?
Oh, okay. So I came, again, you don't want to come from a Western perspective. You want to come from an Indigenous research perspective. So my methodology was called Critical Indigenous Research Methodologies. And that was to be sure that I looked at things from an Indigenous perspective rather than tried to come up with it from a Western medical perspective. So that was the methodology that I used, so that it was telling their story versus telling it from a Western perspective.
Yeah, yeah. So I imagine there was a lot of back and forthing among you and them, and
Yeah.
kind of getting it right.
Yeah, well, first of all, I had to include Indigenous people. So my research question was looking at the fact that there were discrepancies between Indigenous ways of healing and modern medicine, and that they were completely almost polar contrasts. And so I wanted to know, from an Indigenous perspective, you don't do research unless there's some sort of a benefit to the community or the participants that you're doing it for. You're not doing it just for the sake of collecting knowledge. So my purpose was to give back something to my local home community and add another layer of cultural revitalization. In other words, add some stories of healing practice to, some people were gathering language and restoring language. Some people were gathering music and dance and restoring those practices. And I was trying to add some stories of their healing practices from the past, which have continued to come forward. So I was trying to acknowledge and utilize identify their traditional healing practices. And I also had like a goal of trying to get it right, because I did a research project in the 90s when I worked for CANA, and I was trying to figure out how historical trauma impacted some of the behaviors that I was working with in the community, the alcohol and the drug abuse and the domestic violence and things like that. But again, that's coming from a damage-centered perspective, not talking about restoring and revitalizing the culture. So I was trying to get it right this time, telling the story in the right way, versus trying to not looking at what's wrong, looking at what's right, and looking at what heals versus what had gone wrong, So
I
yeah,
wonder,
so yeah.
so as we speak, I'm working here in the hospital on the adult medicine teaching service. And I wonder what hospital medicine would look like if Indigenous people could revamp it, could come in and put an Indigenous spin to what we do. Because we're so convinced that we don't need to know anything about the person besides their lab values. And so this was my first day with the residents. They'd been with a woman for 7 days. And so my question when we left the room was, so what's her first language? And they looked at me and said, we don't know. And I'm like, well, it might be interesting to know where she's from and how she got here. And they're like, why? And I just thought about the way that as you said, we've so fragmented the whole person or the whole community into these little bins, and we're so convinced it's so good, that it's just definitely the way to go. And I don't know if I can get a question out of that, but maybe it's rhetorical. What would it look like if it were more Indigenous? I mean, Do you have
Well,
any
to go
thoughts?
back to your original question about what is the Indigenous research approach, critical Indigenous research methods understand that Indigenous people think and behave in ways that are unique to their worldviews and their experiences. And so there's this emphasis on the 4 R's: relationships, responsibility, respect, reciprocity. And then there's an accountability in our interactions with the human, physical, and spiritual world around us. And that's kind of a paraphrased quote from Brayboy et al. And so I guess an Indigenous approach to, asking somebody how to help them with healing would be to ask them what they thought, what the imbalance was. What do they see as the cause or the source of what's going on in their life? And I think determining that source of imbalance has to be, from what the participants told me in this project, was that's individual. I can't tell you what somebody else's, it might manifest as a sore back or a sore neck or substance abuse or anger or whatever, but determining what their source of the imbalance is, that has to come from them. And then they also have to be integral in defining what the approach or treatment should be, because that has to be unique and distinctive for that either individual, family, or that community. And the healers, we're just conduits to restore those energies and help, in other words, to help them identify. You do that all the time, help them identify what their story is, because then they have to say what the next chapter is going to be. We just are witnesses and facilitators of that story and participate in that story as they request for us to participate in it, versus telling them what the next chapter of their story should be.
Yeah. And that's what we do in the hospital. We tell people what the next chapter of their story should be. And we get so surprised and puzzled and even hurt when they disagree with us, when they have different ideas about what they want to do. And yeah. And I suspect that we're not rewarded for forming relationships. It doesn't get the hospital paid any more money. And you know how it is. They give us slightly more work than we can possibly do in the time allotted to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so everyone's trying to find ways to cut corners, to get done on time, to get home on time, and to not have to stay late. And the first thing to go is relationship. And it's probably because we don't think it matters for healing.
Mm.
We think it's all pharmacology.
Mm-hmm.
It's all the drugs that I give you, or the surgery that you get, or that sort of thing. There's no human element involved. And so we, and I suspect that goes to the very top of, someone in Washington, at Center for Medicare or Department of Health. There's no reward for relating.
Mm.
And so doesn't happen.
Yeah, you can't connect it to a charge.
No.
You can't connect it to yeah.
You could actually, in a funny way, because you could bill at a higher level if you spent more time,
Mm-hmm.
then you wouldn't get home on time.
Or lunch.
Or lunch. And it's more important for the doctors in the hospital here to get home on time than it is for them to generate more money for the hospital.
But they're trying, and to look at it from their perspective and try to understand. They're trying to keep balance in their own life. They need to get home to their family and their relationships, and that's what's not recognized. And how often are we told not to have, here in Kodiak, you can't do it. You can't go to Safeway and not see people you work with. You can't go to Walmart and not see people you work with. And in the medical arena, we're always taught to keep our professional relationships in one category and our social and family relationships in another. It's not possible in a lot of ways. And Indigenous cultures recognize that it's kind of silly to pretend that you can, put a different hat on and be a different person for different types of situations or interactions.
It is. It's almost as if it's all performative in the mainstream culture, as opposed to genuine. Yeah, and because I know where I work, when I see a new patient, we spend the first 10 minutes figuring out who we know in common, and who I know that person is related to. So it's just how it's done. I mean, you couldn't do it any other way. And but the physicians who are in training here, that would just seem completely bizarre to them. Like that would seem like such a waste of time and completely useless, because it doesn't produce an action directly the way a low potassium would, or an elevated calcium.
But if you go back, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and the other thing that makes it so undesirable to relate is that they spend probably 20 times more time with the chart than with the patient, because the chart has to be full of unnecessary, unneeded, duplicated information for billing purposes. And one gets the feeling that our purpose is billing and not health. So mostly we sit around in a room with computers and write notes. It takes much longer to do that than it does to walk around and see the patients. It's an odd, if you think about it from an Indigenous lens, it's very bizarre, what we've created.
Yeah. But they think if they see it in the chart, it's objective. And so it's more valid than if you hear the patient describe what they read in the chart from their own perspective. Right. And tell you why it means something to them or doesn't mean something to them.
Yeah. I wondered if you had I know Judy's camp in Kodiak is one example of revitalization. I wondered if you had seen anything happening in the healthcare arena where you are.
Canna is working really hard at trying to do that, and Libby, who's the Native Studies faculty at Kodiak College, is working with Canna, and she has a Chamai club, and Canna has people in different departments, Kodiak Area Native Association. They're trying to put on some of these programs. I think I mentioned to you one time we were talking on the phone that they did a event for Indigenous Peoples Day called History, Historical Trauma and Healing. And Libby, a lot of people here don't even know the history of the colonization that happened. And so, first of all, putting that out there and letting people learn where this, originated, this colonial, how we got to where we are right now, was helpful. And then it generated discussions, and it highlighted one woman's healing journey. But Libby's working with Canna, and right now they just have a new interim community health director, and I work with him too. I teach the psych nursing course for all the students in the state, so I had him come and be a guest speaker, and then we started talking about other things. And he and I are going to probably, when you come here, we're going to have you come and talk to the employees there, because he made a really insightful comment that I was happy to hear him say. He said they want Canna to be more, culturally relevant, but their idea of that is to say Chamai when they start the meeting, and Koyana, which is thank you at the end of the meeting. And there's more to understanding the culture than that. And so he is trying to work at that. So I would say that people in the community are doing their own thing. So Indigenous people are, as I said, restoring their language. People are working on that, recreating traditional costumes and celebrating the ingenuity that went into creating that costume or that clothing or that kayak or that dance, and then creating their own dances and their own songs, and making that vibrant, their own art. So they're doing it on their own, but as far as having it be formalized in the healthcare setting here, I can tell you that it's not something that I see in the hospital. We have a Providence hospital here, Providence Kodiak Island Medical Center. And then Canna is not a hospital. Canna is a medical clinic. And so what they're trying to do is get the word out about what we're talking about here today, and have the employees that work with that community. And it's a community health center now. So it means that not just Indigenous people can come there. My husband goes there. He's a vet, and he's been going to Canna for his health care for quite a while, but it's now open to any community member can go to Canna for their health care. So I would say that the effort that I do see in the healthcare arena and the agencies around here, including the hospital, are starting to open their eyes to what's called trauma-informed care. I'm sure you know about that. So that's just a little like crack in the door about trauma-informed care would also involve this historical trauma, these colonization efforts. So that's a little bit of an open door to help people kind of get what we're talking about, as far as including that in their assessment, or asking about it even, in order to have people start to tell their stories. But that's what we're working on, is trying to have programs like what Libby had, and continue to have these networking opportunities. And one of the things she did for Stop Smoking Day that I thought was really fun was she had an event where people came and learned how to create a smoked salmon dip. So stop smoking, let's put the smoke into the salmon and eat it as a dip. And I mean, just funny things like that are, again, relationship building. People come together and they have a good time. Or we have Gayla Peterson, who's here. She does a lot with herbs, and she'll do a talk on an herb and then show them how to make a balm or a tincture out of that herb. And so these efforts are happening, but they're not part of the medical system, or they're not part of the healthcare agencies, I wouldn't say. And so I'm hoping when you come up here in March and we go around and do some of these talks, that they're going to realize that these can happen in interactions, individual interactions, and program policies that they might be able to start doing that. We have an auxiliary. I did a little bit of a talk to them, to the hospital auxiliary, but I think you're not going to see them ask for it. We're going to have to offer to provide this information. And then hopefully the lights will turn on, the light bulbs will go off.
Yeah. And I've been thinking about that for our region. And I thought one of the first things that I would do is tear down the IHS buildings, because they're like like a long rectangle, and there's, if you were thinking about how would you design an Indigenous clinic, the example that comes to my mind is the Aboriginal Health Unit in Winnipeg, where it's built in a circle, and the offices are on the outer part of the circle, and there's a large shared common space in the middle, and they have a grating that can be taken out so that a fire can be lit in the middle of the building
Wow.
with a ventilation system to take the smoke out the roof.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I don't. There's a smaller version of that in Thunder Bay, Ontario,
Hmm.
and I thought that's what I would want to do. Instead of having waiting rooms, I'd have gathering rooms and make the providers wait for the patients instead of the patients wait for the providers. And there's we have a little bit of that where I am now. We have a large community room. It's not round, and it's at the end of the building, but it's open to anyone anytime that the building is open. And people just come hang out, whether they have an appointment or not. And there's computers there for them to use, and it's where Wellbriety takes place and yoga takes place there, and the addictions and co-occurring group takes place there, which is kind of fun because people can just sit on the margins of the group, even if they're not in the group, and check out what it's about. But we still have little boxes for offices, and luckily my box is bigger than most boxes. I have the biggest box in the building, and so we do groups in my office, group acupuncture and group osteopathy, but I just think that I was thinking about how that sort of structure lends itself to the kind of non-relatedness and hierarchical behavior that is the healthcare system. That sense that you come in and you're kept separate from everyone until someone in a uniform comes and gets you and pulls you by your collar, by your leash into the sanctity of the building, and make sure that you don't encounter anyone too directly until you're thrown into a room and the door closed. And then you wait, and you might wait for a long time. You're waiting on someone who's therefore more important than you, because they're not waiting on you, you're waiting on them.
Right.
And they enter in a hurry, and they leave in a hurry. And sometimes you don't know what hit you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
They may not even look at you. They
they may
may
not
just
even
be
look at
looking at their notes or their chart or the computer screen.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, it would be so different. It could be so different. And I suspect people would be healthier. That that relation, that we get we hear so much about quality markers. I'm sure you do too. And the big ones are blood pressure, hemoglobin A1C, screening for depression. There's two
Sepsis,
others. Yeah.
fall risk.
I know that I had to have a physical for some reason. And I went into the PCP's office, and this young woman is standing at a computer, and she says, "Are you ever afraid of falling?" And I said, "Do I live in Maine in the winter?" And she said, "That's not an acceptable answer."
Oh my gosh, talk about closing the door to communication.
Right. Yeah, it wasn't one of the check
Unless she was
boxes.
joking, unless she was trying to kid back.
No, she wasn't. She was very serious. It
Mm.
wasn't one of her check boxes. It was
Oh, she couldn't find the answer to the checking answer. Yeah.
right. Because the checkbox was yes or no.
Mm-hmm. And then the other thing about those check boxes, you want people to say no to their assessment question because they don't want to have to open up and do that whole assessment about like sepsis or fall risk or whatever. They don't, please say no to that. You don't think about hurting yourself, so I don't have to do the suicide risk assessment.
Right.
Please don't say yes to any of these questions.
Right. That's why she was so upset, because if she interpreted my answer as a yes, she'd have to do this whole fall risk assessment.
Yep.
And it's odd. I mean, if you look at it from an Indigenous eye, it's all very bizarre. That, I mean, why wouldn't you talk to me to find out if I'm feeling sad? Why should I do a PHQ too? I mean, because it's a human being asking me these questions. And then what does she do with it? Just puts it in the computer,
Mm-hmm.
which doesn't mean that the next human being will look at it anyway.
Mm-mm.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've been trying to implement is everyone who comes to our clinic gets a life story interview, so that we know the high points of their life, the low points of their life. We know what they're proud of. We know when were things the best in your life. And I think it makes a huge difference, in interacting with people. And but it takes 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, we got off on my rant about the healthcare system, but I suppose it relates, because it's what we need to change. Why couldn't Canna have hour appointments?
Mm-hmm.
And this notion that you have to make a new appointment for every problem, which I'm sure you've heard.
Right.
I mean, that ignores problems of winter, transportation, co-pays. It's
Oh, that one drives me crazy.
yeah. Why can't you just come in and spend an hour and get things taken care of?
Because they don't see the connections. This might not be what they came here for, but it's still related to their health, and it is connected, and especially connected in their mind. So to try to separate it out, well, I can't talk about that because it's not part of my backache. It's, but maybe it is. Maybe that backache is the manifestation of the emotional pain, and so.
Yeah, we two osteopaths and I and Barbara did a workshop yesterday for the osteopathic college on, we called it rabbit medicine.
Mm,
And it's combining stories and osteopathy and movement for people who are wounded.
mm,
And one of the things that came up was that we like the word wound better than trauma, wounded
mm,
and traumatized.
mm-hmm,
And we defined wounded as anything that perturbs the system in such a way that homeostasis is lost and elements of the system are decoupled. And so we said, and when that happens, then any symptom could occur. That the important
mm-hmm,
thing is that it happened,
mm-hmm,
and whether it's manifest as eczema, low back pain, or depression isn't as important as the fact that it happened,
mm-hmm,
and that the unhappening of it, has to do with restoring the connections among the elements of the system so that homeostasis can be recovered,
mm-hmm,
which is another way of saying balance.
mm-hmm.
In Lakota it would be wichozani is balance. And I thought, it sort of gets at, from another angle, indigenous medicine, which is looking at the insult,
Mm-hmm.
like what happened
What happened? Yeah.
and how did it affect you, and how do we restore the connections that were disrupted.
Right.
You know,
Well, if you go back to that diagram and it being like a flow of energy, something disrupted that flow, something made that flow wobble, the energy wobble, and the balance is not there, but it can restore, the balance can be restored if you figure out how to make that flow be uninterrupted again, if you figure out how to identify what the disruption was and let that energy flow freely again. It'll restore itself. I mean, other things will contribute to, it wants to be in a balance. It wants to flow evenly and steadily. So getting that, like you said, the disruptor out of there.
yeah. So so we've come to a good stopping point, I think. And
Okay.
it's many more conversations to be had before healthcare system is changed. But
Mm-hmm.
there was one elder who told me, if you want to change the world, start talking, keep talking, and don't stop talking.
Yeah. I'll just add to that, the banya was the Russian word, Magiwik was the Alutiiq word for steam baths. And so you talked about gathering places and relationships. That's something they focused on a lot too. So keeping those connections and those gatherings, those are healing just themselves. And so that goes along with what you just said. That's where they talk. That's where they worked out with themselves and their family and relation. The women would go in there together, or the men would go in together, or families would go in together. And that's where they did a lot of their talking. And that was a place that was mind, body, and spirit all in one gathering spot that was very traditional for here. And kind of sums up everything you just said. It's the place to talk and keep talking.
Yeah.
Don't stop
and
talking.
it happens here too.
Mm.
It's not called banya here.
Is it a sweat lodge more than a steam bath there?
We're trying not to call it a sweat lodge. We're calling it a revitalization ceremony.
Ah, oh,
And
is it steam or is it heat from a dry fire?
No, it's steam. We
Steam.
bring the rocks in.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how it's done in a banya. I'd like to
That's
experience
steam
one.
and rocks too. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we heat the rocks on the fire.
Megiwik. Yep.
Yeah, and bring them in and then pour water on them and
Water.
whoosh.
Water. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the word in Lakota is inipi kaga. Ini means to breathe, and inipi means they breathe.
Mm.
And so it's that notion of breathing in the vapors coming off the stones to
Mm-hmm.
revitalize you. And kaga means ceremony. So
Mm.
they breathe ceremony.
Mm.
So, and sadly, I don't know what the local word is. I should learn that, and I should ask some of the elders.
I like that when I first came here, they called it banya, which was Russian for steam bath. And then now they call it Megiwik, which is the Alutiiq word for steam bath. So it's another example of how they're reclaiming, what was already theirs. They did it before the Russians came here. The Russians just named what they saw them doing. And
Right.
so Megiwik is